being double claimed in various ways. And then lastly, projects also need to consider some of the social environmental impacts that they might be generating. So principles that are important are ensuring sustainable development benefits to communities that might be involved in the project, making sure that human rights are respected, and that they have free, prior, and informed consent when they participate in projects. And also ensuring that the project activity helps the global economy get closer to a net zero state. So things like enhanced oil extraction or a more efficient oil extraction would not fall into that category. That's kind of the exclusion of that specific activity. It doesn't tend to be high quality. Um, so, generating those credits with all of those requirements in mind can be a pretty lengthy process. For most projects, that takes several months to sometimes years, or often years, especially in the case of um, nature-based credits. And it involves a lot of different actors. So if you start at the beginning, you have this climate project, you implement a mitigation activity, say you implement a renewable energy project. Um, you have to first kind of look at the feasibility of the project. Does it comply with the methodological requirements? Um, Go maybe to an investor and get some finance and design that project. Prepare a lengthy document that lays out transparently how you're going to be calculating those credits, how you're going to be protecting the environment and the communities involved, getting that auditing, registering with the standard, and so on and so on until eventually the credit gets issued, which is basically the stamp that it's ready to be traded on the market. So it can be quite a complex process. I know speaking from working for an organization that produces nature-based carbon credits, um, there is a lot of effort and investment that has to go upfront to get these projects off the ground, but we still do them anyway. The reason for that is because we see carbon markets as a really useful mechanism within the suite of climate solutions. For one, they make climate mitigation more cost effective, allowing us to finance projects that might not otherwise be financed, but that are less expensive than what mitigation within a corporate's value chain might be, which allows them to pay for ultimately more mitigation than they would be able to achieve within their value chains alone. Another great benefit is that climate carbon finance doesn't just sit within, the boundaries of the country where that company operates. They can help distribute climate finance beyond their own country borders into places like the global south that otherwise don't have sufficient carbon finance to mitigate a lot of the emissions that they are targeting through the Paris Agreement. And on top of that, having that distribution of finance to communities and oftentimes to nature in these carbon projects, carbon markets are better able to support sustainable development, support ecosystem services, protect biodiversity. So they all have all of these additional benefits to them that are we call them core benefits because they are also, critically important to address with these joint crises of the biodiversity and climate crises. A couple other really exciting things that make carbon markets a good mechanism is that, especially with the voluntary market, they help incentivize the mitigation of greenhouse gases that are not regulated under a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. And they also tend to incentivize new mitigation activities that might not otherwise be tested and be implemented. So that's at a high level, kind of the common underlying elements of carbon credits. But But if you look out at the market today, you see a large variety of market contexts. So I want to talk a little bit about what those markets are and how they differ. Um, so I think broadly, carbon credit markets can be broken out into four categories: the voluntary market, the Article 6 market, Corsia, and various regulated domestic schemes. In the voluntary market, there's no regulatory authority. It's basically companies who have these voluntary net zero targets that come out and say we want to buy credits and reduce our emissions internally um, in order to, make a claim that we are, making a climate impact. Whereas with Article 6, this is a market within the Paris Agreement that allows countries with national climate targets, or NDCs, to trade emissions reductions between them through something called cooperative approaches. So that market is regulated by the UNFCCC, and national governments take that guidance from the UN and actually regulate them domestically. So it's a sort of a joint regulatory system. And again, in this market, we're trading between governments. So it is a kind of government to government marketplace. Next, we have Corsia. Um, it's a very long acronym, but basically stands for a compliance offsetting scheme specifically for international airlines that are not covered by NDCs because they involve emissions that are shared between two countries when, a plane flies from one country to the next. So ICAO, which is another UN body, has the jurisdiction to regulate those emissions and require airlines to reduce them through the purchase of carbon credits. And then lastly, I'm sure you've also seen a lot of cap and trade markets and carbon taxes out there that occur at the national or the subnational level, and regulate how many emissions or put a price on the emissions that corporations within that jurisdiction are producing. And many times they'll also have some allowance for carbon credits. So that's where the carbon credit market piece comes in. So just to quickly touch on where those markets sit today, they're all in sort of varying stages of implementation. The voluntary market is seeing some pretty significant shifts over the past few years. There's been quite a few critiques of the quality and integrity of the market, which has caused it to kind of stagnate at around $1.5 billion a year. But analysts are still pretty optimistic that that number can grow if we can resolve some of the integrity skepticism around that market. There's also tending to be also more of a trend towards removals, which I'll talk a little bit about later, um, and also higher emphasis on high quality because of these criticisms that have been coming up. But the market is currently active and operational. The Article 6 market, on the other hand, is technically operational. The negotiations at COP29 in Baku this year um, really finalized some of the key texts that allowed countries to start trading. But we still need that additional step of countries kind of regulating those frameworks to be able to start trading. And again, that's something I'll talk a little bit more about the technical details of that later, in addition to the 6.4 mechanism, how that all plays into this. Um, but nonetheless, there's a lot of infrastructure being built, including countries starting to sign bilateral agreements that they'll start to trade, and projects receiving authorizations that the trades can happen. So a lot of progress happening in the last couple of years around Article 6, but not much trading at the moment. I would say the same is true for Corsia. They just started their first voluntary phase in 2024, and they've approved several different actually voluntary carbon market standards to be used within their compliance system. So trees, ACR, Gold Standard, Vera. These are all voluntary carbon market standards that were adopted into Corsia to say which credits companies under the mechanism would, or countries under the mechanism would be allowed to use. But again, there hasn't been much trading. A lot of that relates back to lags in the Article 6 framework, and also the fact that supply is pretty limited at the moment. And then lastly, the state of domestic schemes. There's many, many of them out there. The number of countries with carbon pricing schemes is still growing. So there's 75 domestic carbon pricing instruments in 2024 alone, which cover 24% of global emissions. And 40% of those allow some use of carbon credits with a cap of anywhere between 5 and 100%. And just to give you a perspective of kind of how big this demand for credits within this market is, 9% of all credit retirements in 2023 were for compliance purposes. So at the moment, the voluntary market is a much bigger source of demand, but that could change over time. I might skip this slide. I think there's a lot of elements here that will be addressed later on in the presentation, and I think we're running a bit behind. So let me dive a bit more into Article 6, unless maybe I want to pause. I see a lot of comments coming through the chat, but I can't see them. Does anyone want to ask a question before I move on?
Oh, thank you, Kim, and thank you, David, for taking on while my network was poor. Kim, thank you for making it here. I'm of the view that you continue to explain Article 6 of Paris Agreement, then I'm taking note of questions in the chat. We will hopefully answer them at the end. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Nelson. All right, then I'll just keep going on with Article 6 and kind of explaining a bit more the history behind it. So the Paris Agreement is a framework, right, for countries to set national climate targets to help the world get on track with 1.5 degree or at most 2-degree warming by 2050. And Article 6 is a section within that Paris Agreement that basically allows countries to trade emissions reductions in order to achieve their national goals. So it is essentially the carbon markets mechanism within the Paris Agreement and involves country-to-country trading. And there's two mechanisms within Article 6 that are important to understand. One is 6.2, which is kind of more the flexible mechanism. The other is 6.4, which is kind of the UN stricter but more structured and straightforward mechanism. I think that's the simplest way to put it. But basically, 6.2 allows the buyer and seller country to trade essentially anything that they want to. It can be any type of credit. It can be even policy outcomes. It can be technology transfer. There's lots of different types of units that can be traded on 6.2. So it's not always a ton or a carbon credit per se. But I do think based on the trends that vast majority of units sold under 6.2 will be carbon credits. Whereas for 6.4, those could all be considered as carbon credits because they are generated by the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC kind of operates as a standard and a registry in this mechanism that will basically adopt these methodologies that validate and verify carbon credits that the buyers and sellers can just go to that marketplace and say, oh, we're going to buy and sell these credits. We're not going to have to figure out what kind of units we're selling. So it is a more centralized mechanism that kind of makes it easier for countries to understand what rules they want to use and what the requirements are for the units that they're trading. And as I mentioned before, it is a UNFCCC framework, but ultimately the rules won't be implementable until countries actually sign that framework into law. So there are a few requirements that countries have to comply with to operationalize Article 6 or to start trading under Article 6. First, they have to be a party to the Paris Agreement, and they have to have an up-to-date nationally determined contribution, or NDC, which is basically a national climate target. And then there are the more kind of technical requirements to participate in Article 6. Um, if you go into the UNFCCC text now, you'll see lots of processes that require authorization, tracking, and reporting of these Article 6 units, which they call ITMOs. And there's also a requirement that no mitigation outcomes traded under Article 6 are double counted. Now, since we have 6.2 and 6.4, the rules of those processes and how double counting is accounted for vary slightly between those two. So it is important to understand that they are separate, slightly different rule frameworks. They have a lot of similarities, but they're not always the same. Um, and just to really emphasize that double counting piece, there's a really important concept in the Article 6 market called corresponding adjustment, which basically requires that when the host country or the seller country sells emissions reductions to a buyer country, they have to subtract those units from their own NDC accounting. Because they get those reductions essentially get transferred to the buyer country and claimed. So it's a really important concept. No units can be traded under 6.2 and almost always under 6.4 without that corresponding adjustment. And a key step to initiate that is something called an authorization, which basically is a stamp of acknowledgement that the host country issues to a project saying, we acknowledge that these credits will be sold to buyer country X with a corresponding adjustment. So this is kind of like the signal that these credits are going to be traded under Article 6. And that mechanism is a really important one to ensure that we're not overestimating the amount of emissions reductions we're getting toward the Paris Agreement, but it also comes with a risk, right? Because for every Article 6 unit that gets sold with a corresponding adjustment, host countries get a little bit farther from achieving their national targets. So there is a risk that potentially they could oversell the number of emissions reductions and come in under the target that they're aiming for. So we've already seen some mechanisms to kind of grapple with this risk. First and foremost, it's really important to understand your country's NDC and how it plans to achieve it. So what are the kind of like the priority low cost activities that your country is already planning to implement that maybe you wouldn't want to export? And so that kind of gives you an idea of which activities to prioritize for trade under Article 6. And then in the existing policies that we've seen come out for countries around which projects they'll be willing to authorize for corresponding adjustment, some of them look at the price. The higher the price, the more likely they'll be to export it so they get more finance domestically. Some of them limit trades according to certain sectors or activities based on where they lie within their NDC. And others just put like a cap basically on the number of units that can be sold in a given year, for example. And I've mentioned a couple times now that these domestic carbon market regulations are really the key next step to operationalizing Article 6. I think that's still very true. And the number of those has been rapidly increasing over the years, over the past few years. really after 2021 when Article 6 was finalized at COP26. Um, and now that we've gone through COP29 in Baku, I think we're likely to see even more policies emerge. I can already say, anecdotally in the news, there's been three or four in the past few months of 2025 that have been published. So countries are feeling more prepared to start, operationalizing authorization processes, reporting processes, all the requirements under Article 6 now that the text is finally clear. So that's a really key step that's currently underway. And then the 6.4 mechanism, that standard and registry that's managed by the UNFCCC is fully negotiated, but needs to still be implemented in terms of the technical details by something called the supervisory body. So this year is a really critical year for figuring out basically which methodologies are going to be allowed under the 6.4 mechanism so that, credits can finally start to be issued as early as 2026. Another key indicator, I would say, of the implementation of the Article 6 market is the number of bilateral agreements that countries have signed. So on the left here, on this left panel, you'll see like a handful of countries that have signed bilateral agreements with dozens of other countries. So these are kind of the key buyer countries in the market today: Singapore, Korea, South Korea, Switzerland. They're some of the kind of leaders on the buyer side, and they are working with lots of countries, especially in the global south, in Latin America, and Africa, and Southeast Asia, and South Asia, um, to establish a partnership and agreement that they'll be trading Article 6 units at some point. There's also been not many, but a handful of authorizations for corresponding adjustment that have already happened. A couple of them from Vanuatu, Thailand, and Ghana for Switzerland. Um, and then also several more from different host countries that have been specifically just for the project, though they don't have an end buyer yet. So they've basically been pre-authorized for a corresponding adjustment, even though we don't know yet where they'll be sold. Another question I get asked all the time is whether nature and Red Plus are allowed to be traded under Article 6. And just to quickly note that the answer to that question is yes. Under Article 6, the definition of what can be traded is that the activity has to fall under IPCC's definition of reductions or removals. And nature activities do fall under that. So for example, the activities under Red Plus here, like reducing emissions from deforestation, enhancement of forest stocks, these are all eligible to be traded. And then lastly, on Article 6, another question I get asked a lot about is the CDM transition and how it will work. So the Kyoto Protocol, which is the predecessor to the Paris Agreement, had what was called the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, which is essentially equivalent to Article 6 today. So there is a precedent for Article 6, but basically with the advent of the Paris Agreement, the CDM is now being slowly dismantled and replaced by the Article 6 mechanism, which countries are trying to make a little bit more stringent, a little bit higher quality. But nonetheless, there are still billions of credits from the CDM that have been issued. And there are a couple of options for countries with CDM credits to move forward, who might be feeling like they don't have clarity on how those can be used. So first of all, any credit or any project that has been registered after 2013, countries will be allowed to use towards their first NDC period without having to use a corresponding adjustment. And the cutoff and anything through 2020. So basically 2014 to 2020 are the years that CDM credits can be used for this first compliance period. Anything after that would need a corresponding adjustment. CDM projects also have the option to transition to the 6.4 mechanism. Um, and so far, over 300 million CDM credits have applied for that transition. And they had to submit their request at the end of 2023, and evaluations are going on now to sort of figure out which ones will be approved by the supervisory body. I think they actually just put out some of the first approvals for energy efficiency projects in their last meeting in February. So more to come there. And yeah, I'll keep going. I want to talk a little bit as well about the voluntary carbon market and kind of the state of it, especially given a lot of the fluctuation in trading and credibility in the market over the past few years. I think it's important to first have an understanding of kind of the key players in the market today. Very quickly, we have project originators that kind of help identify project opportunities, project developers that actually go in and set out the plan for what the mitigation activity is going to be and how the credits will be quantified, things like that. We have the financiers who provide that upfront funding to kind of get the project started, which can be quite expensive, especially if the project development takes several years. I mentioned the role of VVBs. So these are the groups that kind of come in and audit the project to make sure they're complying with the requirements of the methodology. Groups like rating agencies have come around to the market recently that kind of evaluate the quality of projects to help buyers figure out which ones are best to purchase from. The registries and standards are the ones who generate the methodologies and provide the rules around how carbon should be accounted and also track the issuance and retirements of those credits. The brokers in the market are the ones who try to kind of centralize the buying and selling of credits in a marketplace. So they provides this kind of like trading hub for the market to operate. The marketplace works closely with the broker. They have basically the technology underlying where the credits are bought and sold. There's also this interesting subset of groups out there who specifically sell carbon credits, not to companies, not to countries, but to individuals. So there's a small group of organizations doing that. And then lastly, the voluntary carbon market in particular is almost all composed of companies, right, who are trying to meet their net zero targets. So buyers like Microsoft, Salesforce, Disney, these are all like large corporations that tend to buy up millions of credits each year. And then lastly, there's a group that I think is really important to emphasize as the market is transitioning kind of to this new phase of higher quality, and that's the quasi-regulatory groups. So in particular, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market is playing a really big role in setting the standard for other standards. So ensuring that all carbon credits meet really stringent, accurate rules for accounting. And then VCMI is another important player here that is setting rules around how corporates should be using carbon credits. All right, so I did pull a bunch of data from this group called Allied Offsets, which gave some of the, like a quick summary of how the market performed in 2024. And overall, the retirement or basically the purchase of credits in 2024 stayed the same and has been roughly the same since 2021. So the market's been a bit stagnant, but it has been shifting in terms of what types of credits are being purchased and retired. So there has been a trend recently toward use of removals, though overall avoidance or reduction credits tend to be the most popular. And just to clarify that when I say avoidance or removals, I'm talking about projects that keep carbon sequestered or prevent them from being emitted, whereas removals are projects that extract greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So there's just a difference in the mechanism of how those emissions reductions happen. Um, well, in terms of more specifically, what types of projects are getting retired on the market on the VCM these days? Forestry still plays a big role, renewable energy still plays a big role, but there are other project types kind of emerging, especially engineered removals, for example, and household devices like clean cook stoves are starting to be used more in the market. In terms of pricing, pricing per ton in the voluntary carbon market has gone down in the past year, mostly because of integrity concerns over red and cook stoves, though prices did go up for nature-based removals like afforestation and reforestation. And corporate buyers, for a long time now, most voluntary corporate buyers have been financial services firms or energy firms. These have kind of been the leaders, though there is a large number of companies out there from consumer goods companies and technology and professional services who are purchasing credits. And lastly, I know we're running a bit short on time. I'll try to spend just a few minutes here talking about RED in carbon markets. RED stands for reducing emissions from forest degradation and deforestation, with the plus basically representing the enhancement of forest carbon stocks. So, afforestation, reforestation type activities. So it's basically any sort of uh, forest management activity that decreases emissions, is specifically in tropical forest countries. And those activities can occur on different scales. So, for carbon markets, there are what we call jurisdictional red credits, which are led by governments and involve mitigation activities that are countrywide or sometimes statewide, depending on how big the state is. Like some states in Brazil do their own jurisdictional red programs. But most of the credits available on the market today are project-based, so they're mostly much smaller than the national level. They're owned and developed by private entities, or they can be community-led. And they're one of the biggest sources of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market today. And there is an approach that allows kind of projects and jurisdictional RED programs to happen simultaneously in the same country, because obviously if you have two at the same time, there's a risk that they can overlap. So this accounting measure called nesting basically is a way for projects and jurisdictional programs to happen in one country at the same time. And there are various advantages to having both programs. I'm happy to go into that more if there's interest. And just to say, in terms of RED, I think it's not just market-based finance that is bolstering RED activities. There's also quite a bit of non-market finance out there, especially from, institutions like the World Bank, the Green Climate Fund. Norway is also a big funder of RED. Whereas, companies, again, with those net zero targets that participate in the VCM are mostly driving or providing the finance from the market-based side. I won't go through all of these different financing options, but this is just to say that there are many out there that either finance project-based red or jurisdictional red, or maybe both. Um, Most of these are also market-based with the exception of the Green Climate Fund, that's non-market-based finance. And they also use kind of different standards for how to demonstrate that the project or the program is ready for payment. So Art Trees is one red standard. Vera has a project-based standard and a jurisdictional standard. The Green Climate Fund has its own kind of proprietary standard. So there are lots of different areas of finance, but they have slightly different requirements to comply with to receive that funding. And this schematic is really just to demonstrate that um, any red country that wants to access finance usually needs to first comply with the Warsaw Framework. These are kind of the five key components of the Warsaw Framework. And then they kind of select, okay, which financial mechanism am I going to go for? They might need to comply with additional steps depending on which standard that finance requires, and then they can receive those payments. So this is kind of the very simplified series of steps to get access to that finance. And it does, I know it may seem very complicated. It is not an easy process and has taken countries many years to kind of fully implement their RED programs. But nonetheless, countries like Ghana have been able to tap into multiple finance streams. And it takes just a lot of, first, I would say, readiness funding. So funding to kind of just help set up the infrastructure to produce things like a reference emissions level or a safeguards information system, um, and also finance capacity building. These are all things that Ghana was able to have access to early on, and I think it has really helped them tap into a lot of different sources of red finance. Um, I just want to close because we only have 5 minutes left, and I see lots of questions, but um, you know, these are very high level takeaways, but I think they're just important to think about in terms of, whether you're considering or already are involved in carbon markets at your organization. You know, carbon markets are a great tool to help tackle climate change, but they're by no means a silver bullet. They can't solve climate change alone. So they really are kind of a supplemental tool. Um, and I encourage you to kind of learn more about what the other financing options are that you can use in addition to carbon markets. Carbon markets are also a really diverse space. It's not just one market, it's many. And there's different sources of demand that might have different rules around how you can participate in the market. So just watch out for that. Though I will say it is getting a bit easier as a lot of markets are starting to have the same idea of, what good quality credits look like. So in some ways, markets are converging. Um, and lastly, for different reasons, I would say some political, some legal, some reputational, each market is grappling with significant barriers and uncertainty at the moment, though I think especially with regards to Corsia and Article 6 and domestic schemes, which are regulated, there's still a lot of optimism that those can grow and scale. And I would say the same is true for voluntary carbon market, though it's not regulated. But it's just important, I think, whether you're a project developer or a government worker, to stay aware of kind of the changes that are occurring, whether it's normative changes or regulatory changes in the market, and stay adaptable and really just, stay aware of the risks that are happening so that you can be prepared if there's a change. Because the market is sort of learning as we go. So these things tend to happen as you implement things for the first time. So I'll just leave you with a list of references here. this is mostly where I got my information from. They're really good resources, and I'm happy to share the slides with you all after we close here. But happy to save our last few minutes for questions. Sorry, I went a bit over, Nelson.
Thank you very much, Kim, for making it thus far. I wanted to share my screen, but I think you still have yours shared.
Yep, I just turned it off. I think you should be able to.
Let me do that. Apologies to begin with, I was not able to make it in the first place because of my poor network, but I want to thank David and Kim for taking the role on. I should not give my opening remarks at this time, but I want to make a few remarks. While we discuss carbon markets and climate change, it is important that we appreciate how these relate. Carbon market, climate change, and Africa's resilience. To me, and most Africans, climate change is more of an existential threat, and this threat is universal. And however, the most affected communities are those living in the global south and mostly the poor. And this means that if anything happens, all the poor living in the global south face the biggest impacts of climate change. And so how would we go about that? The call is that each person, each state, each member of the country to the Paris Agreement has this role to play. But the baseline is that we all have or we share responsibilities, but these are differentiated depending on our respective capabilities. There are questions that have been put forward asking who is responsible for emitting and how are we going to reduce the emission. At this time, the world needs more of solutions that each one of us can contribute. The blame game may not be of great importance. We are talking about an existential threat. Whereas I'm saying that the poor and the global south are the most affected, this does not exonerate those living in the global north, in the developing country. However, how can Africa and other developing countries contribute to the climate goals, yet it is evident, for example, in Africa that we suffer absence of local experts. This is everywhere. However, it is important to note that different institutions across Africa are coming up to fill this gap. The example in question is the Mandera Climate Resilient Institute that is already building local capacity across sub-Saharan Africa and Africa at large. And the belief is that these local experts that are being built, they will design carbon projects, they will come up, they will develop credits that speak the language that reflects the context on ground, that explain or represent or reflect the circumstances on ground. As I conclude, I totally believe that carbon markets are not a socio-economic breakthrough for Africa. They actually are incentives to reduce emissions and to enhance emissions sequestration. And it is just a source of additional finances to catalyze Africa's socio-economic transformation. It is very important that mostly our communities, I've seen a question where someone is asking that I have farmers willing to plant trees. How can we get them on board to start earning credits? while you are working towards earning credits and earning some finances, it is important to note that the baseline is that you are contributing towards saving mankind. Climate change, as I said, is a crisis that is threatening all of us. So while you are looking to earn from it, be mindful that actually the basic goal, the fundamental contribution you are making is to save mankind. Credits and the trading comes in to give an incentive to do more of what we are doing. I want to thank Kim for making it thus far. And I see we have a million questions in the chat box, which I'm afraid we may not answer all of them, but I'm going to pick a few, 3 or 2, and then we attempt to answer those questions. Important to tell our participants is that this conversation is ongoing. Our contacts of Mandera Climate Resilient Institute are available, and we are building capacity. We have over 70 participants that are undergoing a training. After these have graduated, they will answer most of these questions we are having put forward. Kim, I would like to read for you 2 questions, and then you attempt to answer them. One says that can't a country use credits for both export and also NDC, that is a national determined contribution achievement, through a cap or surplus modality? How possible is that, Kim?
Sorry, Nelson, I missed the second part of that question. What modality?
Can't a country use credits for both export and also NDC achievement through a cap or surplus modality? CAP as in CAP.
Cap. Okay, I see. Well, I guess to answer so the first part of the question is getting at whether credits can be exported and used towards the host country's NDC. The answer to that is yes, but there are some buts attached to that situation. So for example, 6.2 under that mechanism, the only way for a country to export 6.2 credits is with a corresponding adjustment. If it doesn't have one, then it can't be traded under that mechanism. But under Article 6.4, negotiators did create this mechanism called 6.4 mitigation contribution units, or MCUs, which essentially allows a 6.4 credit to be sold, but also claimed by the host country. In that case, the buyer would not be able to make any claims about those units, so they would have to basically agree to let the host country make that claim in their NDC, and it would almost be sort of like a philanthropic contribution towards the host country's NDC in that scenario. The same is also true for the voluntary carbon market. There's no requirement on that in that market for a corresponding adjustment, so countries are free to choose to either require them. Some very limited examples of countries are requiring corresponding adjustment for voluntary credits, but most are not because they see this opportunity to get finance from companies with net zero targets to help them meet their own NDC. So those are kind of the scenarios under which you can still export credits without a corresponding adjustment. One resource I really recommend to look at to understand when you need one and when you don't is TNC's Article 6 explainer. It does a really nice job kind of laying out what a corresponding adjustment is and where it may or may not apply.
Thank you, Kim. One last one. I think this comes in because you are in California. Someone is wondering that USA have threatened to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and is wondering where does this leave the carbon market?
Yes, this is where I'm glad to be speaking on individual capacity because I definitely um, I share concern about this. So US has actually already withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. We're no longer representing, there's no US representation at any COP meetings for the foreseeable future. Um, and impacts on the market, it's speculative, right? Because it's pretty recent, this development. But I would say at this point, Article 6, US has actually not been very active. They haven't signed any bilateral agreements or publicly indicated any intention to purchase Article 6 credits. So for the moment, that kind of just stays true, and the level of supply and demand in Article 6 in 2024 is still the same, if not expanding in other countries. So it's encouraging to kind of see that growth coming from other countries, even if it's not going to be the US anytime soon. Um, I think the same is true for compliance markets. We're not likely to see compliance market anytime soon in the US. There's still questions around whether the US will withdraw from the Corsia scheme, though for the moment, they're still in it. Um, and then lastly, with the voluntary carbon market, I think this is the most uncertain kind of outcome, because again, none of those countries are regulated. But certainly the administration is providing a lot of reasons for companies not to want to engage in climate right now. So there is a risk that demand could be impacted. Though I will say for the moment, a lot of the US, some of the biggest buyers in the US at this moment within the VCM haven't really outwardly said anything about how they plan to purchase credits or changing any of their strategy. So that's, I think, a positive indicator that, demand will continue. But I think we'll learn a lot more in the next 6 to 12 months how that will all play out.
Thank you, Kim. We are 8 minutes past the time we had set, but we shouldn't go without responding to a question which I'm going to take on, this time not going to Kim. Someone is wondering about the progress of carbon markets in Uganda. Briefly, I would say that as far as I know, the carbon market regulations were gazetted and they wait minister's endorsement, then thereafter to be availed for public use, hopefully soon. And when I talked about 70, a cohort of 70 that are undergoing training in carbon market, this was the call that was issued and about 230 people applied, but we only selected 70 people. We hope to issue another call for whoever is interested in getting this knowledge. Lastly, I want to thank Africa Research Network and the Africa Research and Impact Network for supporting this public lecture. And I want to greatly thank Kim for sparing time to speak to us. I understand it's quite early in California now, but you had to be able to be with us. And I want to thank each one of you for turning up. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. See you soon. God bless you.